I'm Ana Lisboa, a web developer from Portugal, just like you. I typically work with Laravel, and today we'll be exploring Saloon, a PHP package that makes it easier to build API integrations. And to use that, we'll connect to an API, sorry about the cat, that lists public holidays in Portugal. What is Saloon? Saloon is a PHP package that helps you build API integrations and SDKs. Looking at the docs, they say that Saloon moves your API requests into reusable classes so you can keep all your API configurations in one place. And that it comes with many exciting features out of the box like recording requests in tests, caching, OAuth 2, and pagination. What I really like about Saloon is that it helps you to organize your API calls and has some useful features like the organization into connectors and requests, how you work with paginated data, the ability to send concurrent requests, retry a request, set rate limits to your API calls, cache responses, and the way it automatically handles errors. If you've ever dealt with an API that always, no matter what, responds with a 200 status code, you will love the way that you can change the exception logic with Saloon. Now, working with Saloon, there are three main components. They are the sender, the connector, and the requests. 90% of the time, you will focus on the requests and the remainder on the connector. The sender is the class that calls the HTTP client, either Guzzle or Laravel client, or other if you make it custom, but you really don't have to. This is typically not changed, and the default sender is Guzzle. The connector holds the basic requirements for the integration. It communicates with the sender, and it's where you define the API URL, common headers, common configs. They help to standardize the integration, and you typically have one for each third party service integration. The requests hold the logic and information for a single API request, and it's where you define the request endpoint, HTTP method, body data, etc. As for the API we'll be using today, it's at date.nature.at/API. You can find the URL on the screen now. This API gives you lists of public holidays for a given year and country, and there are endpoints for all holidays in a year. You can search for long weekends, see if today is a national holiday, among few more other options. Today, we'll connect with the available countries and public holidays endpoints. And now, let's do something great. I have a fresh Laravel 10 app where we will be installing Saloon. And for this, let's follow the docs. We need to copy this command to install Saloon in the project. Let's run that. And then we'll also be installing the Laravel plugin for Saloon. And after the first command stops running, I will continue on with the installation. There we go. We can now install the Laravel plugin and let's see what we need to do next. And it is publish the config file. We can do that now. And let's take a quick look at it in the config Saloon. Here it is, just two configurations. And with this done, we can now get to our integration. Let's run the command php artisan saloon connector, and we'll call Nature, which is the name of the integration, and the holiday connector, which is the name for the connector file. Let's open that and take a look at it. We have the accepts JSON trait on line 10, and that is a Saloon plugin that indicates we'll accept JSON responses. Then we have three methods. In the resolve based URL method on line 15, we define URL for the API we are connecting to. In our case, let's look at the examples on the documentation website for the API. The URL we need to connect to is this, including v3. Let's just paste that in. On the default headers method On line 23, we would define headers common to all requests for this service. Let's leave this empty for now. And finally, on the default config method in line 31, we could define config options for all the requests. Since we are using Guzzle, we could define here all of Guzzle's request options like cookies, multipart, timeout, stream, and others. Now it's time to create our first request. Let's do that with the command artisan saloon request nature, which is the integration, available countries, and this is the name of the request. Oops, I am missing PHP here. And now we have our first request created. Let's open that. I suggest firstly that you name your requests like the endpoints, so it is immediately clear what endpoint you are connecting to. Going back to our API, we have the available countries endpoint, and this is the first one that we'll use. Inside of this class, we have the method definition, and this is where you'll set if you'll be calling a get, a post, whatever you're using. And in the resolve endpoint method on line 18, this is where we define the endpoint we are connecting to. And in our case, we need to define this, we need to set this to available countries. Also, let me try and change this name to have it cased correctly. Now it's looking a bit better. And to test this, we can create a route in our application, a get route. Let's call it the same name as the endpoint and return a function just so we can see what is happening. I am missing a comma. And inside this is where we'll instantiate our connector and the request. First, let's call the connector, which is our holiday connector. New up this, and now let's call our request. Let's new up our available countries, and now we'll need to return the connector, send the request. So we are instantiating a new connector and we are telling it to send a request to the API, and let's see if this actually works. So going back to the browser, we have a list of the countries, which is what this endpoint actually does. It gives us a list of all available countries, and then you can take the country code to use in the next call. Let me make it a bit bigger. And we have made our first API call using Saloon. It was quite easy, right? I thought so. Now let's go to our next API call. Let's call the public holidays endpoint. So as we've seen before, we need to create a request. Let me just copy and paste the name of this endpoint here. Holidays. I'm missing PHP again. And we can resolve this endpoint. Now, what we need to see here, this API call requires for two variables. We need to pass in the year and the country code. To do this, we need to define the constructor for our request. Public function struct. And in here, we'll receive two strings. The first is year. The second is the country code. And we can actually define this as protected with only string. And let's do that again. This way we don't have to define the variables before the constructor. And now we only need to pass this to the resolve endpoint method. So we can have the year, this year, and this country code. We just switch, and I think that this should be it. And now when we call this endpoint, let's call it public holidays too, and we need to switch the request that we are calling, and we pass in the year. Let's call it 2024, and the country code, if I'm not mistaken, for Portugal is PT. And let's see how this works. We have a list of public holidays with some informations about each one, like are they fixed, are they global, the Portuguese name and the English name, and some other more informations. Now, since we have some time left, let's dive in a bit more on Saloon. We can take a look at caching responses. I think that for a list that is as static as this one, it could be a really good thing to try and see caching working. And also, this is a good way to speed up your responses if you are using an API that doesn't change that much. So, firstly, we need to install the cache plugin for Saloon, and we'll then follow the docs on how to configure it. We need to add the cacheable interface to our request. Let's see if it finished running. It did. And let's do this on the available countries. For instance, let's implement the cacheable class. And then we need to use the has caching trait. We import that. And then we need to add two methods. Let me just do that from here. On the resolve cache driver function on line 28, we need to set the default cache driver to use. Sallon supports three different drivers, and let's go with the Laravel cache driver. We can copy that from the docs, and we can see those information here. Where Saloon tells you that it takes the PSR cache driver, the fly system, and Laravel cache driver. Let's go with Laravel, and I think we can copy this. And instead of Redis, let's do a file cache, since this is just for demo. And what is happening here? Okay. And on the cache expiring seconds method on line 33, we set the time it takes for the cache to invalidate. Since this is a pretty static data, let's go with 1 year and return 60 minutes, no, 60 seconds times 60 minutes times 24 hours and times 365 days. So it will cache for a year. And next, to test this, let's go back to our routes file. To do this, we'll grab the response from the API call, and we'll return the response, and we can call the isCached method on it. Let's see this on the browser. On the first run, this should return 0, and on the next run, it should return 1. So we need to import something here. Let's forget about this and just import. Okay, and also the cache. And now we can go back and say that it returns a driver. Refresh this and we have nothing, so it could be 0. Let's try and refresh this and we have 1. What can we do to further see this working? Let's put a DD here. We have a 1, okay, a true. Let's go PHP artisan cache clear. We should have a 0 now or false. Yep, and run this again. And we have true. So our response is being cached just like that. We added 2 methods, added 3 lines, imported a plugin, and that was it. Now, finally, let me quickly just show you how you can dodge the API that always returns 200 responses. I've suffered with this, and I'm sure that it's a pretty common thing to come across, unfortunately. So, looking at the docs, you can see that there is a specific section called Customizing when Saloon thinks a request has failed. And this is developed especially for those 200 response call status, but when there's an error. So in this method, what you can do is that you can dig through the response and tell Saloon, hey, this is how you see the response failed, not by looking at the HTTP status. If your response body has the text server error, this is what Saloon will be looking at to see if a response has an error or not. Now I want to thank you for joining me on this first exploration of Saloon. I hope that I've piqued your interest, and if you want to keep learning, check out the Saloon docs and its official book called Consuming APIs in Laravel. Feel free to join me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll see you next time.